Okay, so in our last lecture, based on race and ethnicity, the basics, based on chapter 5, we began to look at models of incorporation, models of racial and ethnic incorporation, and now we're going to dive in to think a bit about alternative ways of understanding assimilation. So we're going to go into full screen now and dive right in. Okay, so Gordon, 1964, identified 7 different types of assimilation responding to Park's ideas. Cultural or behavioural assimilation, which he referred to as acculturation. So this harks back to Park's idea of assimilation as making like. It refers to a situation in which members of different ethnic groups share a common language, values, folkways and mores, and general worldview. Secondly, structural assimilation. This refers to social integration on several areas of life: residential, educational, occupational. It is also the inclusion of previously excluded groups from membership in institutions such as voluntary societies and fraternal organisation, the breaking down of barriers to public facilities such as trains, buses, parks, hospitals, schools, etc. Marital assimilation is achieved when you can choose who you marry. We talked about prohibitions on Germans marrying Jews, and in the US for many, many centuries it was illegal for a black to marry a white, and that was the case in many other countries as well. So this is marital assimilation. Identificational assimilation, which is a somewhat awkward term, and it points to the type of assimilation that occurs when the members of different groups develop a shared sense of peoplehood at a societal level. This category is obviously related to cultural assimilation, but is nonetheless analytically distinct. It is nonetheless analytically distinct. It points to an assimilation in which group differences can persist, but don't hinder the prospect of a shared identity despite difference. The powerful feeling of being an American in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 and the parallel sense that many British citizens felt in the wake of the 7/7 bombings illustrate what Gordon is meant by this type. Another type is civic assimilation, and it's similarly connected to both cultural and identificational assimilation. In this form of assimilation, inter-ethnic conflicts over values and powers are overthrown by shared identity predicted on citizenship. In other words, in everyday life and modern societies, people assume a variety of distinct roles, including their ethnic and racial roles, and citizenship is one of these roles. Moreover, it is not simply one amongst several competing roles, but can become a major source of social harmony in the process, damping down the potential for ethnic conflict. In addition to that, attitude receptional assimilation is a distinctive way of saying that there is a lack of prejudice, or at least a very low level of prejudice, such that negative attitudes and stereotypes of particular groups no longer constitute an impediment or barrier to incorporation. That is, attitude receptional assimilation. Behavioural receptional assimilation is the counterpart to the preceding type, in this case involving the absence or low level of discrimination that is significant to eliminate this barrier to full inclusion. One of the virtues of this typology is that it allows for an ability to distinguish between facets of assimilation and to see it, and to see that it is possible to find an evidence of assimilation in some cases and little assimilation in other. Thus, blacks are by most measures culturally assimilated, but often live in a highly segregated neighbourhood and send their children to equally segregated schools. Okay, so let's go out of full screen and we'll pause now, and when we pick up we will look at evidence for assimilation, and we're going to be looking at the idea of white ethnics. And again, most of this material is based in America, but I want you to have an eye for the relevance of this for you here in Thailand. When you read about the way that immigrants are assimilated in the US, the way that previously bilingual people become monolingual English speakers, that maybe only some Italian Americans, only some German Americans, some Korean Americans, some Japanese Americans, and I could go on and on and on. The way that only some people continue to speak their native language, the language of their fathers and their mothers and their grandparents. What is the relevance of this for Thailand? What forms of discrimination and exclusion exist in Thailand? So although this book is mostly presenting issues of race and ethnicity, drawing on examples of these dynamics of conflict and of incorporation from North America, what is the relevance of this to you? What forms of exclusion would you identify in Thailand? What forms of exclusion exist in Thai cities? What forms of exclusion exist in Thai provinces? What forms of exclusion exist, and what forms of assimilation exist in the north, where there are upland ethnic minorities? What forms of assimilation existed in places like Bangkok, which incorporated Khmer and Mon and Malay, immigrant and slave populations, as I've illustrated? What does assimilation look like in the northeast? Predominantly, overwhelmingly predominantly Lao, but also with significant Khmer populations in the south on the Cambodian border. And what does it look like in the Malay south? So think about those things as we move on with this.